Once we knew we were going to have this event at the Swedish American Hall, of course, we had to import a Swede, so we did that. Magnus Hagander is a member of the PostgreSQL Core Team and a developer and co-committer in the PostgreSQL Global Development Group. He currently serves as the president of the board for Postgres Europe. And please welcome Magnus and his talk about the PostgreSQL community. And here's hoping the magic projector works.
Please work this time. Okay, I think we have technology working. Just cross fingers that it stays working. It was very complicated earlier. Okay, good morning. So happy to see a whole bunch of you here for the first PgDay SF. As Christoph said, my name is Magnus Hagander. I work for a company called Red Pill Infra, which are sort of a generic open source services business in Scandinavia, and I'm out of Stockholm in Sweden. So, as you said, I think that's why they choose this venue, to basically force me to come. But I'm always happy to come to these things. I'm a member of the Postgres Core Team. I'm one of the committers who doesn't do as much as they should be. And as Christoph also mentioned, I am the president of Postgres Europe right now, which is the European version of basically the United States Postgres Association that are the ones who are formally putting on this event here today. But that's me. We're supposed to talk about Postgres, right? I assume everyone knows what Postgres is. Did anyone get into the wrong room or something? At this event, I would assume everyone knows it, right? So as we all know, Postgres is the world's most advanced open source database. And now we know everything. But the interesting point is, how did it become the world's most advanced open source database? Where did it come from? Like, how does it work? And what you'll find if you look throughout the business or the IT industry, there are a couple of projects that are different, and Postgres is one of them these days. If you look back far enough, that's how most projects work. But if you look at products in particular, if we look within like the database space, for example, how are other databases built? Where do they come from? How do these things happen? Postgres is, in that part of the business, almost unique in how it works and how the community-driven development differs from a lot of other cases. Most competition uses different models, right? Some of them are very old models that we know and hate. Some of them are new models that we don't know as well and hopefully don't hate as much. But there are very few that actually uses this complete community model that Postgres does. So if we look again in the database market, the traditional ones are either things like you have your traditional, company-owned proprietary databases. We all know, Oracle, SQL Server, Sybase, DB2. There's no question of how this works, right? One company owns everything, one company does everything, and you pay through the nose to use it. And then we have the currently most popular model, I think, if you count the number of databases, if you look at the whole industry, which is the company-sponsored or company-controlled open source, where the product is open source, but all contributions, or the vast majority of all contributions, are coming through one organization. All planning is happening through one organization. All sort of developer ownership is coming through one organization. Here's where we find our MySQL and MariaDB within the SQL space. We have MongoDB. We have mostly all the other NoSQL databases are acting within this space. Now again, if we look at company-owned proprietary, it's kind of easy, right? There's one company that owns the product. There's one company that employs all developers. You're not going to find a developer actually working on Oracle, not working for Oracle, right? They're going to be building applications using Oracle, but they're not going to be working on the database engine itself. We have one company that provides all support because they're the only ones who can actually 100% know how things work. Now in practice, we all know nobody actually knows exactly how things work, but they know more than others. And they usually work through a big network of partners who will then have sort of extra access to the inside secrets that are only known to the people who can actually look at the source code. And this is our traditional software development model, right? And you typically license it for individual uses one way or another. Your company might, in the case of an Oracle, you might have n number of servers, or you might have n number of CPUs, or you might have a site license for unlimited use within your organization. But in either way, there's like an individual license for each entity that is using the product. And if we then go looking at the company-sponsored open source, the main difference here is that the product itself is open source. It may be open sourced under a myriad of different licenses, but the difference is you can look at the source, you can do things with it. But in these models, what most end up doing is there is still one company that controls the development. Right? They're publishing the product as open source, but the actual development happens according to more traditional patterns where one company controls it, they decide what gets done, they decide what gets accepted. There might be outside contributors who send in patches and functionality, but there is this one big entity that controls and makes all decisions about it. Usually what we see in these cases is that this one entity also ends up employing most of the developers, not necessarily all of them. That's the difference, because since everything is open, you can have outside developers, but given that all the control sits within this entity, most of them tend to end up being there. That's just like the dynamics of it. And one of the bigger differences here is that many different companies can provide a high level of support without necessarily cooperating with this original vendor, because they can all look at the source and see, oh, that's how it actually works. That's why this isn't working, here's how you fix it, kind of thing. So we're getting a little bit further there. And then, of course, we have the combination of these two that is a way that a lot of the players in the market of open source today monetizes on their products, which is you have the same product, but you have both models. You have an open source version, and we have a proprietary version, the enterprise version, or whatever you want to call it. And the open source follows the open source model, and the proprietary version follows the traditional model. And then there are different ways of controlling and making your those customers who are willing to pay to use the version that they have to pay for, while still making it possible for the others to use the open source version, maybe by adding features that only the big customers need, things like that. These are models that we're all used to, right? And in this case, obviously, it's even more important that one company retains full control, because it's only by doing that that they can also have a proprietary version of the same product. You can't do that if somebody else owns half your product. Well, you can't sell their half. And the typical thing is, again, proprietary only features, which means to a lot of people, it ends up being basically a proprietary product where you get to look at the source code. And you can do some things, but it doesn't get all of it. So how does that apply to Postgres? Well, Postgres follows none of the above. Right? Postgres doesn't have any of these two models, which most others end up doing today. There is no company in Postgres that actually owns Postgres. There is no company in Postgres that controls the product Postgres. Instead, there are many different companies that employ all the developers. I don't think we can find any company that owns or employs the majority of Postgres developers. There is obviously somewhere one company that employs the most developers. It's just how math works. But that alone is significantly less than 50%. So we have many companies doing it. Likewise, we have many different companies that are providing support for Postgres and services around Postgres. There can be hosting around Postgres and add-ons around Postgres. And they're all doing it on equal terms. And one of the differences in this sort of more pure open source model is like there's no partnership. Like you can't say, oh, we are a Postgres support partner. Because who would you be partnering with? You're all part, like all these companies are part of a group that are all sort of playing at the same level. Then yes, if your company is putting in 100 people doing Postgres support versus another company putting in one person doing it, you're going to be bigger. But if this one person is really good, that's an argument on itself, right? So they're all sort of competing while not competing at the same levels. And what this also means in the end is that there are many companies that own the product. And there are many companies that control it, which comes with its own set of challenges. like, you can't go ask somebody, what's the roadmap? Because there's nobody who actually decides on what the roadmap is. You can ask an individual developer, some of whom you'll find in this room, for example, say, hey, what's your roadmap? What are you going to be working on? You can go ask an individual company saying, what features, what things is your company going to be investing in? But nobody can tell you what the others are going to do. So it becomes very different from the consumer, the user perspective as well when you look through these. And what it really means, and where the real difference is, it's not just many companies, but it becomes much more about the people. So it's many persons who own the product, and it's many persons who control it. Now, of course, from the perspective of Postgres, I decide exactly what I work on. Right? Now, in reality, of course, if my employer wants me to work on something specific, they'll tell me to do that, and kind of have to do that because they pay me, right? That's how it works. But from the perspective of the project, it's the people that count, not the companies. The companies are sort of a means to get there, but it's the people that's the important part to actually getting us to where we go. And they all work together. And that's one of the things that I personally, sometimes I think about it and I was like, how does this work? And I really have no idea. Because we have these people who are all working for companies that are direct competitors. They're working against the same customers. They're winning and losing bids on the same projects. In most businesses, that would be like, yeah, it's them and it's us, and we're not going to help them, right? Because helping them hurts us. But instead, all of these people are actually working together, helping each other. And I can't really say how that works. I can only say that it does. Because in the end, of course, a better Postgres ends up helping all of these different companies. And that's obviously the premise for it. And it also means that you can't, like a company can't easily run away and do something weird because the people are working together and they will just leave that company. We've seen this happen. Right? So where does that leave us? Who actually owns Postgres? Because that's a question that comes up every now and then, particularly if you start talking to the legal departments in organizations that don't really know what open source is and how it works. They go, well, who owns it? And the answer is no one. Well, we got to point at an organization. No, nobody really owns Postgres. Or everyone, depending on how you want to put it. But this is one of the points, again, where Postgres differs from most of the other big open source projects as well, because the way it looks now is most open source projects have this one company that drives it. Or sometimes it's even a foundation that drives it. If you look at like Apache, at least they have the Apache Foundation that drives it, but there's still the one entity, it just happens to not be a company. Postgres doesn't even have that. So in the things that make up Postgres, one of the things we have is something called the Postgres Community Association of Canada. Who has ever heard of this? Okay. These are all people that I know personally who are involved in the organization of Postgres. So this is a registered Canadian non-profit organization. The reason that it's Canadian is entirely historic. It doesn't really matter. As you know, Postgres itself originally came out of Berkeley University, right here. Which, as far as I know, is not in Canada. But there were, at some time, there was, the Postgres code got moved and was just hosted in Canada, and yep, it turned out to be in Canada. Now, the PGCAC, or the Community Association of Canada, doesn't actually do anything. They don't do any development, they don't sponsor any developers, they don't do anything like that. They own the Postgres trademark. They own the postgres.org domain name and a couple of other related domain names, but they have no actual activity. I think their entire activities come down to one board meeting a year that happens to happen during the PGCon conference in Canada, because that's where most people are. But other than that, they don't actually do anything. And they don't own Postgres, the source code. The copyright of the Postgres source code is assigned to something called the Postgres Global Development Group, which is even more interesting because it doesn't exist. Like, there's no registered entity anywhere called the Postgres Global Development Group, yet it owns all the copyrights. That's kind of an interesting setup. And to a lot of people, that's kind of weird. And you try to explain that to some of these legal departments, and they're like, no, go away. Like, we want to talk to someone who knows. But there have been people who've actually talked to lawyers from the Open Source Initiative and Free Software Foundation and these guys, and they're actually saying, that's awesome. Because now nobody can actually find the owner and sue them. Even if the license also says you can't sue them, like they literally don't exist. So there have been discussions about whether that's good or bad, and the conclusion has been it's actually pretty good. But that really sort of knocks down the whole, nobody actually owns it. You can say that the Postgres Global Development Group consists of every Postgres contributor ever throughout history. And that's a lot of people, and we don't even know who all of them are. And certainly many of them, we have no idea how to contact them because they made a contribution sometime back in the 80s and nobody's seen them since. You're not going to find those people, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because of how the license of Postgres works, right? It only matters in that it can guarantee that nobody can take this and claim ownership over all of it. Because it's this sort of loosely defined group that has the actual ownership. And then we have a couple of associations around the world that solve different things where you need to have real proper registered organizations. Because there are a lot of things that are a challenge when you don't exist. For example, if you don't exist, you can't have a bank account. They really frown upon that. I mean, there are countries who sort of made a career in allowing you to do that, but they're starting not to be as happy about that anymore in other countries, so they're getting into trouble. So there are a bunch of things, and one of the big groups around this is the Postgres Europe group, which I represent myself, where our sort of charter says we coordinate advocacy efforts around Europe. You can sort of tell from the name that we're in Europe, right? We organize conferences, we help send people to conferences and do things like that. But it's also important that we don't do all of them. If we look particularly, if we consider things like conferences in Europe, Postgres Europe runs most of the big events. But there are a number of sort of medium-sized events where Postgres Europe supports them, we don't run them. And then there's a whole bunch of events that we have no involvement with at all that run. Because again, nobody owns and controls Postgres. Nobody can tell them, you can't do that, right? As long as you're not misrepresenting, because we can go back here and say the CAC owns trademarks, right, and domain names and things. So you can't go misrepresent the Postgres name, but as long as you don't do that and you just say, well, I want to run a Postgres conference. Sure, go run a Postgres conference, right? It's harder if you go and say, hey, I want to run an Oracle conference. Then Oracle can go say, yeah, but you can't put the Oracle name in anything here, because that's ours, right? But nobody will do that around you. So Postgres Europe runs a lot of them, but not all of them. We established guidelines for how some of these others run to basically say, well, if you follow these basic guidelines, then we will support you, even if we're not involved in running it, and just sort of to set a standard level that our community members and that our users of the products can expect when they go to one of these events. But even so, the only thing that we can do if they don't want to follow these guidelines is say, okay, we won't market you, right? That's pretty much all it goes. We're not stopping them. And that's a strength of the community, that it can't do that, right? You don't have these very strong controlling entities. And then the other thing that Postgres Europe does, it's just generally assisting with things around, but it doesn't also, again, do any development. No development work is done by the nonprofits. We don't have employees. We have volunteers who get voted in to do unpaid work. Welcome to nonprofits all over the world, right? That's how it works. We have a similar thing here in the United States. The Postgres US, or the United States Postgres Association, I guess is the formal name, as Christoph mentioned, which in a lot of ways does the same thing in the US, right? They coordinate advocacy efforts across the US. They organize conferences. They don't organize all of them. They organize this PgDay, for example, and the big Postgres Open event. They don't do the PGCon in Canada. That's done separately. There are PgDays all over the US, run every now and then. There's a lot of associate events that run next to a bigger thing. I think there's been PgDays close to Python conferences and things like that. Some of them are run by Postgres US, some of them are not. They do the same kind of work around guidelines. They do the same kind of work around assistant. They have something that Postgres Europe does not have. They have a formal program for grants, particularly around things like diversity grants and things like that, where Postgres US is a step ahead of Postgres Europe in that they have formalized this process, which we have not done in Europe, and probably should, because it would be helpful. But having a formal process always helps, right? And this can be around, enabling people to go to events like this, to join them, or sort of anything around helping the people who otherwise could not make it into the community. But in a lot of ways, Postgres Europe and Postgres US are very similar. And we have similar associations all over the world that do different things. So then it comes, so actually, who actually runs this then? Okay, somebody runs this, right? How does this work if nobody runs it? And the answer is, who runs the Postgres community? No one. See, this is a simple answer to all the questions. Who's doing it? No one. And somehow things still get done. So what does it mean? Well, one thing that I've always seen, and I even know people who are employed to work full-time as managing and running communities. Like, how does that work? Like, what even does that mean? To me, that's just a strange definition, because nobody is actually managing anyone else, so how do you manage them? I'm sure most of us here, unless you're basically your own company, has a manager one way or another, but that's not managing in the community. That's managing maybe your community project. But you get to when nobody in the community can tell anyone else what to do. So if there ever was an example of herding cats, right? And yet somehow it works. But nobody manages anything. Now there are specific technical things that are being managed, because that's easier. But there is nobody that manages the people. So what really makes up the community then? So who defines what is the community in this case? Well, it's literally anyone who's involved in any way with anything. Obviously, everyone who writes the code for Postgres are part of the Postgres community. That's pretty obvious. Anyone who writes documentation, that's obviously also part of the community. Answering emails on the mailing lists or questions on Stack Overflow or hanging out on IRC or Slack, these are all the Postgres community, right? The people who bring coffee to the developers are most definitely important members of the community, right? Where would Postgres be if nobody did that? We'd be in trouble, right? Now, we normally don't count it all the way back through the chain to the people who are like growing the coffee. We usually stick it within, but in theory, you could almost argue that they're part of it, and then we have total world domination because everyone in one way or another is involved, right? So it really is everyone. But then there are some sort of slices of things in it, but the important part is the ones that are members of the Postgres community are the people. A company, my company, Red Pill Impro, is not part of the Postgres community. I'm part of the Postgres community. A number of my colleagues are part of the Postgres community. We have a bunch of nice sponsors represented out here. Those companies are supporting the Postgres community, but I'd say technically the company is not a part of the community. They're sponsoring events, they're sponsoring people, those people are part of the community. Whether they're the ones who are working on the Postgres project itself, or they might be working on the vendors' proprietary hosting solutions. One way or another, these are all parts of the Postgres community bringing it all out. So people may represent a company, or they may not. There's fewer people now, but there are a lot of people still in the Postgres community who are there completely outside of the work. And they can be in any role, and they can be from anywhere. Now, it's more troublesome for people who are in countries where it's really hard to get internet access still, at least to things that are outside of your own country. But we have people in the Postgres community working out of Cuba. We have people in most countries. I don't actually know if we have people in North Korea, but probably. We just don't know about them, and we don't need to know about them. But in defining what really is the Postgres community, there are still a few defined roles, right? Within this everything, there are a couple of roles that are defined that are who we really are. There is the Postgres Core Team that some people think is sort of the almighty entity that runs everything. And having been part of it for a number of years now, you could not be any more wrong. But the core team has the job of setting policies. It doesn't necessarily mean they write the policies. Like, other people contribute suggestions that policies should look like this, and the core team will say, okay, that makes sense, or go out in a bigger, broader poll and ask more people. But in the end, they're the ones who say, this is now defined as the policy. They manage things like it's the core team that decides who gets permissions on the technical infrastructure. Who gets permissions to actually push to our Git repository, things like that. The final decision lies with it. The core team is supposed to handle disciplinary issues. Luckily, we don't have a lot of them. Unfortunately, we have more than 0 of them. And it's definitely the part of the core team work that sucks. It would be much easier if that never happened, but unfortunately, the world is not perfect. It used to be originally that one of the main jobs of the core team was to coordinate releases, because we have all these people writing features, and at some point someone has to cut a release. That is mostly decentralized and handed off to other people now that are sort of just overseen by the core team. We have a release management team. We have the groups of committers. These are the people who are more deeply technically involved. And in theory, the core team are also the team that makes the decision when we cannot find consensus. Now, Postgres works very much like, the stereotypical, say, Swedish society, which is all decisions are made by consensus. And in theory, everyone's voice has the same weight. Now, in practice, it's, of course, if you're a full-time Postgres developer and have been so for 25 years, people are going to listen more to you than someone who just showed up and have never heard of. But they'll listen to everyone, hopefully. Now, this is an extremely rare thing where the core team basically goes in and say, okay, this discussion is over. This is the decision. I think the last time that happened was when, no, we're not renaming the project. It is going to stay PostgreSQL, but you are allowed to say Postgres. That's the last time this happened, and that's going to be 15, 20 years ago now. Right? So, but in theory, that thing is still there, right? Now, the core team is made out of 5 people. It has been made out of 6 people for a long time, but it's currently made out of 5 people. It is a self-elected body, which comes with its own set of challenges and downsides, and upsides and downsides, and left sides and right sides there, but that's how it works, right? Now, it represents multiple companies. One of the few rules says that no company can have more than 2 people on the core team, because that would give a company a majority over the core team. It wouldn't give them a majority over Postgres, but over this one role. Right now, there's one company that has 2, and then there are 3 people who are representing individual companies. And the rule is basically, well, if one of those 3 people were to get hired to twist it, then they have to step down and we have to find someone else. But the core team does a lot less than people think. And unfortunately, most of the time the core team spends is doing these things that are really actually terrible, dealing with people behaving badly and things like that throughout the community. And it doesn't do a lot of development. The people who control the technical future of Postgres is our group of committers. Now, Postgres uses the term committers as we used to do in the old days, back when we were running CVS or even when using SVN, which is very different from today's world of distributed version control like Git, where everyone's a committer. But if you were to rename them, like the equivalent today would be they'd be the Postgres pushers. I'm not sure that's such a great title. So we're sticking to committers. But what it really means is these are the people who have write access to the central Postgres code repository. Now, given the Postgres license, anyone can just create their own repository and do things there. But this is the sort of official blessed central repository. These are the people who write the Postgres code. I think probably the Postgres committers together represent a majority of the Postgres code, but it's certainly not all of it. They spend a lot of time reviewing other people's code, and they spend a lot of time maintaining code. Right? So this is the team that are the technical gatekeepers of what's going to turn into Postgres. This is about 25 to 30 people. I think the formal count right now is 29, I think, but it's really hard to say because some people haven't been active in several years. There's a loose definition that if you've been inactive long enough, you will eventually get removed, but there is a long delay through this. It requires a long-term commitment. Like nobody gets added as a Postgres committer having been in the community for only a year or 3. It requires that you're showing a long-term commitment to the community, and this, a lot of it is about the taking responsibility down the road for maintaining things. Like that's what being a committer in Postgres is really all about. And it is important to know, and this is something that I spend a non-trivial amount of time explaining to new entries in the Postgres community when we're talking about new corporate entries, is that committers are awarded to people. I keep hearing the question from people coming in, we are a new Postgres company, we're going to launch an add-on to Postgres or a service, hosted a cloud version of Postgres or anything with Postgres, and say, what do we do to get our committers? I'm like, well, you don't. Because as a company, you don't get it. Now, of course, if you want to have committers on your roster, well, you can go out and try to hire them, but better, sponsor your developers to be able to make this long-term commitment. And once they've done that, it happens automatically. Sometimes it happens automatically and it takes way too long. Right? But the committers are really the group of people that own the technical parts of Postgres. They are the ones, the release management team, for example, are formed out of committers. We have a security team that's formed out of committers and core, basically. There are one or two other people. But they're the technical gatekeepers. And then we have, of course, we have the local NPOs, which are important and are generally never involved with the technology. This is where we have Postgres Europe and Postgres US and these. And the main reason that they exist is that they have a strict legal definition. Right? They have a board of directors, they have elections, they're registered with tax agencies. Some of us are unlucky enough to be registered with tax agencies in France, which is, I promise you, a very interesting challenge. But they sort of take those parts aside. Postgres is also a member of SPI, or Software in the Public Interest, which is where sort of the global Postgres community is in. This is an American nonprofit that other big projects are part of as well, like Debian Linux, for example, is part of SPI. So if you go to Postgres and say, well, my company would like to make a monetary contribution to Postgres, well, you can either make it to SPI, in which case it goes to sort of the global community, or you can make it to Postgres US, or you can make it to Postgres Europe. As I'm guessing most of you are Americans, it's probably easier to make it to the Postgres US. And both Postgres US and SPI are registered nonprofits. What is it, 501 something or other, C3? That means it'll become tax deductible. You're more than welcome to donate to us in Postgres Europe as well, but it's not going to be tax deductible in the US. Sorry. But they only exist to do that. And these are mostly well-separated parts of Postgres. And it hasn't always been that way. These roles have changed over time. Once upon a time, in the dark ages, it's not entirely dark, but it was a long time ago, being on the core team implied you were a Postgres developer. It implied you were a committer because there was actually a one-to-one mapping between core team members and committers. They were the same thing. There is no actual relation, and in fact today, only 4 out of the 5 core team members are committers. It used to be only 4 out of the 6. Because as a member of the core team, you have very little technical influence, right? The committer role then sort of took over. It came out of the core team and said, okay, we need more than these 5 people to do development. And then a lot of it moved into, okay, committers used to do more or less all the development. They still do a lot of it. But in particular, our committers spend a lot of time reviewing code, reviewing patches, reviewing contributions that are coming in from people who are not committers. So sometimes you wonder, like, why do people strive to be Postgres committers? You just have to do the boring work now, right? Because writing your own code is more fun. There's a lot of cleanups, and again, maintainability and quality. This is the job of the committers today. So it's been a long time since we went from core team is committer is developer to being, okay, core team is one thing and committers and developers are the same thing. And now they're really 3 very different things. And this helps. I mean, it's a growing community. We're adding more people to Postgres every day. And this is a challenge in a lot of ways, right? We add developers and we add users. Adding users is easier because there are more layers that you can easily scale with people who help by answering questions and participating in discussions. And we got all these other community members who are not developers or users, and we keep adding them as well. There used to be a time, does anyone recognize, is anyone here in this photo? I don't think so, not this time. This used to be the Postgres core team. I don't remember exactly when this is, but it's a long time ago. And at the time, as you can say, it's mandatory to have some level of facial hair and to be an old white dude. Some of these people are still in the core team. I think 2 of these people are still in the core team. The others aren't there anymore. But this used to be Postgres back in the days. These were all the developers. And then we still, already back then, we had users and we had people answering questions or whatever. These were the guys who built Postgres. And back when this photo was taken, I think this was just about to change, but none of the core team was employed to work on Postgres. All the contributors to Postgres were users. And pretty much all the work on Postgres was done in people's free time, unless it was done by people at university, doing it during studies, right? Now, this is not necessarily the case today. And a lot of things changed, and it turns out it's, in 2006, Postgres held something called the Postgres Anniversary Summit. It was 10 years after the creation of PostgreSQL, and almost 20 years after Berkeley started working on Postgres, right? And this was the first time that the senior Postgres contributors from around the world actually met in person. They'd all been working together for 10 years. Most of them had never met. And at that point, this group had now grown to this, right? So it's picking up. But in particular, at this point, everyone in the Postgres core team was paid to work on Postgres. They weren't necessarily paid to work on Postgres full time. They were paid to work on Postgres, or they were paid to work with Postgres, depending on how you look at it, right? Some might spend most of their time building applications on top of Postgres. Some would spend their time writing Postgres itself, but they were all paid to work within the Postgres space. And it's around that time, sort of 04, 05, 06, that this really changed, that the core part of the project started being fully employed to do it. Prior to that, it was very much, the stereotype of open source is, people sitting around in the basement hacking. Some people were very literally doing that. And we saw similar things if we look at other contributors. Around this time, a lot of things changed. A lot of the people who are answering questions on the mailing list are people who are today paid to work on Postgres one way or another. They're probably not paid to answer questions on the mailing lists. That's sort of just part of what they end up doing. There is still a lot of unpaid work there, but the portion of work that is being paid for on Postgres today is much, much bigger. But it has scaled with this model that says it's paid for by very different entities, by different companies in different places, and all these things. And Postgres has always been around this. It's always been about local, right? It's always been decentralized. It's always been distributed. It's been so online and it's been so offline, and that's one of the things that has the strength. As we mentioned, geographical communities like Postgres US, Postgres Europe, we have a very strong geographical presence in Japan, a couple of other places. The Indian groups are growing big now. We also have a couple of communities that are language-based instead. We have a German-speaking, which is not just Germany. We have a French-speaking, which is not just France. We have a Spanish-speaking, which is not just Spain, etc. So these are all going. Now, as a representative of Postgres Europe, I will, of course, focus on Postgres Europe. Postgres Europe had its first official meeting or official conference event for Europeans in 2007. That was Postgres Europe in 2007. This is how many Postgres users around Europe we could drum into one place. We went to Prato in Italy. Now, just to put some perspective, at this point, Postgres 8.2 had just been released. We got create index concurrently in warm standby, right? File-based replication. Who remembers deploying file-based replication? Good times, yeah? I guess most of you are newer than that. That's all good. So just a year later, we've grown to this. Came back to Prato, we about 4 times the size. And you can think, the community was really taking off. Again, hey, we had XML support. Feels really modern now, doesn't it? A lot of things have happened over the time. And it kept going up, right? In 2015, a couple of years later, we had trouble taking the photo because there's too many people joining the Postgres community. And as an example, for those who've been on the US side, I neatly skipped over. I see this was 2008. I skipped 7 years ahead. During that time, the United States community, United States Postgres Association, got started with their Postgres Open Series conference, for example, which then ran 4 years and moved to Dallas, Texas in 2015. Also growing in size, not as big as the European one, but kept moving forward. Of course, a lot of things that happened. We no longer had file-based replication. We had streaming replication, almost magic, right? We had PG upgrade. Postgres 9.0 came with PG upgrade. Who was scared of using PG upgrade in 9.0? Yeah. Who actually had a disaster with PG upgrade in 9.0? Wow, only the 2 of us. It was really scary back then. It's a lot less scary now. It's still a little bit scary. So we had those things. If we look at it, this was the Postgres Europe conference in Lisbon in 2018. We had to go outside to take the group photo because we couldn't actually make it work otherwise. Postgres Open spent 2 years in San Francisco to do that. Who attended Postgres Open when it was in San Francisco? Okay, a couple of you at least. The rest of you missed out. It was a great conference. Of course, now we had Postgres 11 with things like, JIT compilation, improved partitioning, and all of these things. These are more current things, so I'm not going to spend time on that. And of course, in the European sense, we filled out a big-ass room in Milan last year for a conference. I know a number of you were there. Postgres Open moved over to Orlando. I don't know where they're going to be this year, but they're going to be somewhere. Being a US conference, they're going to be in the US, I'm pretty sure. And they will tell us soon. That's awesome. And what we have now, well, we see Postgres is moving forward, right? The community is moving forward, and we're growing in every direction. And of course, this growth comes with challenges, right? How do you actually grow without causing pains? And one of the ways that you do that is by growing local, because growing local is actually comparatively easy, because it's distributed. And as we know, we're computer engineers, right? We know that distributed stuff scales. So we like to work from these central community side, from Postgres Europe, from Postgres US, from the core team, etc. We like to encourage and help new communities build their local things. More user groups, more of these co-events where there is a PgDay attached to a Python conference or a PgDay attached to a Ruby conference and things like that. Local events like PgDay San Francisco here is something that we really encourage because it makes it easier to scale this out. We don't necessarily want to put everyone in the same room, right? Because this type of event becomes more personal and very useful. Now, one thing that we do have that took many years of discussion around Postgres is the Postgres community does have a code of conduct. It is a very simple one. After many years of bike shedding, as I'm sure those of you who've ever been involved in these discussions know that it tends to be, it's a fairly simple one. Nobody should really have a problem with it. It is easy. Unfortunately, experience shows that we need to have these things. I would love it if we didn't need it. But having created it and seeing reactions throughout the community, once we finally had one, we definitely needed it. Right? Now, it helps bring in the new people. It particularly helps bring in the new people local. And by bringing them in local, we can grow them up to enter sort of the global Postgres community at a second stage. And if we exclude them already from the local, that's never going to happen. Growing developers is actually much harder. Because, of course, we need more developers, but what we really need is more people helping to do review. And doing review is harder. Like, number one, it needs more experience with Postgres before you can review code. And it's also not as fun. Right? Writing new stuff is more fun than reviewing old stuff. And eventually, this goes in, we're going to need more committers, right? And now we need the long-term support, long-term commitments, because it's more about the maintenance. And I don't really think, like, we don't have a solution to this, but this is where our biggest challenges on the growth side really is. And we want to do this while maintaining this user representation, maintaining the independence, right? We see a lot of people who have actually sort of, as they grow in the Postgres community, that's good on their resume and they get hired away to do other things. We'd like to do this without promoting someone to committer and then immediately losing them somewhere else because it was a good career step. But of course, if it is for them, then that's what it is. Other people just decrease their commitment over time for other reasons, and we need to backfill that somehow. And we need to encourage our commercial growth with all these companies around Postgres, and try to do that while maintaining independence. Because the vendor independence of Postgres, I would say, is one of the biggest strengths that we have, and one of the biggest things that this community builds, is this independence, that if one vendor starts misbehaving as a customer, you can just go somewhere else. And we want to keep that going. We want to make sure that we don't get the one entity that runs everything in practice. We want all sorts of companies in control, big and small. We want more of them, but we want this community of the people to be in control. And unfortunately, yes, we do. We see every now and then, we see entities that want to control the community. They're successfully failed a if you will. Nobody succeeded in doing that now, but this is a pattern that we see because, of course, as a company, you look at the database market and you look at Postgres and goes like, I'd like to own that and like make all this money somehow, right? It's very lucrative. Now, in fairness, those who have tried have failed and lost money on it. Like, there are a number of people who have tried hard and not succeeded, but we need to work and make sure that it doesn't happen in the future, right? Because everyone will fall. Some of it is some people just want to exploit the community for short-term gain. Usually it's not people, to be honest. Some organizations want to exploit the community for short-term gain. Some people actually want to help, but it's just being misguided because they're actually like derailing things over long term. These things happen. These are the things that we need to be careful about. But we need to encourage the commercial growth as well because that's where all the other growth, like that's where the money for the other growth comes from because we all somehow need to get that. So in the end, it's really all about like growing a community while maintaining the community. And that's hard. But the way to do it is to do it together, right? Everyone in here is now, well, you come to a Postgres community event. You are now a part of the Postgres community. If this is your first event, well, then welcome. And if it's not your first one, then welcome back. The Postgres community needs contributions at all different levels. Answering the simple questions. Explaining why you didn't understand something, right? There is a documentation that says something, it doesn't make sense to you. Either, if you can, please tell us how to fix it. If you can't, then please tell us what you think is wrong with it. And someone else who might know the code side better can then say, oh, here's a good way to fix it. These are all relatively simple contributions that we can all make and that will help us grow the Postgres community in this user-centric and user-focused way. Thank you all for listening to me for a while here, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I think we might have like 2 or 3 minutes if anyone has any questions. Yes? Yes. So it's an interesting question. So the question is, what about specifications, right? What specifications lead to this code? And in the way that it works in Postgres is, I mean, we have, at some level, we have the SQL standard, the SQL standard ISO specification, which is terrible, but it's there, and it's a formal specification of how SQL is supposed to work. And if a feature is in there, then that's sort of the high-level specification. At lower levels, we don't do a formal specification process within the community. Of course, if you're working on a bigger project, the way that you do it is you write some sort of a technical specification of what you're about to write, and then you post that, and that is discussed in sort of 1 or 50 rounds of discussion on the mailing list to agree on, okay, this is what we want to do. And then you do the code, and which hopefully fulfills the specification, whereas smaller patches will sort of do the code and then say, this is how it works, and this is sort of reversely into the specification, but there is no formal process around this. There's no lasting document against which the behavior can be compared. This is correct. There's no lasting document for the specification. Now there is, I mean, part of it is there are tests that specify it. There are some features and some parts that have their technical specification as part of the source code. There's a README file that describes how, you know, the memory management subsystem work or the indexing subsystems work and these things. But again, there's no formal process that enforces this through every piece of workflow. How do you feel? It works. That's all I can say. I mean, this is always, yes, there are definitely things that would benefit from a more formal workflow. But having also worked in organizations that have very, very formal workflows, if you go that far, that's an excellent way to kill community-style development. There is a balance in between them, and I think it's necessary to have the ability to deal with both of these types of projects. But there are definitely cases where having this a little bit more strict would probably help. Anyone else? Okay, then thank you very much, and I think you'll have a chance to refill your coffee before the next speaker. Thank you.